August 23, 1942. Just after midnight, off the rocky shore of Paramashiro Island. The sea was calm enough to be misleading. Dark water rolled gently against the rocks, carrying only the familiar sounds of wind and waves. Nothing hinted at danger. On shore, the night felt ordinary. No sirens, no aircraft engines, no reason to believe the war was anywhere nearby. Then something broke the surface. Not far offshore, a submarine rose slowly from the water, deliberate and unhurried. Its hull blended into the black Pacific, almost invisible. There was no panic in the movement, no sense of retreat. This wasn't an escape. It was an approach. Moments later, the deck gun was uncovered. The first shell shattered the silence, its sharp crack echoing across the shoreline. It landed inland near coastal facilities, bursting in a flash that briefly lit the hills. Another round followed, then another. For the first time, naval gunfire struck the Japanese home islands from the sea. There had been no warning, no aircraft overhead, no fleet on the horizon. The attack came from the one direction no one expected, low, quiet, and impossibly close. Confusion hit the shore before fear did. People rushed outside, scanning the sky for bombers that weren't there. Local defenses hesitated, unsure what they were responding to. The sound didn't match an air raid. The flashes weren't above them. They were coming from the water. This was a submarine, on the surface, deliberately firing at land. Aboard the submarine, everything was tense but controlled. Crewmen worked the gun quickly, loading and firing, while constantly watching the dark horizon for patrol boats or aircraft. Every second on the surface was dangerous. Coastal batteries could come alive at any moment. Aircraft could appear without warning. The commander understood the risk. Submarines weren't built for surface attacks this close to enemy shores. Surfacing here broke every rule of survival, but that was exactly the point. The goal wasn't just damage, it was shock. The shells were aimed at coastal facilities, places that symbolized distance from the front. These weren't battlefield positions. They were locations that existed under the belief that the war was happening somewhere else. That belief ended with the first explosion. It was 1942. Japan still considered its northern islands untouchable, too remote, too protected, too far from American naval power to face a direct threat. In the Japanese imagination, the Pacific War was supposed to stay far from home. The submarine proved otherwise. After the final rounds were fired, there was no delay. The gun was secured. Orders were passed quietly. The submarine slipped back beneath the surface, leaving behind smoke, darkness, and questions no one could yet answer. The physical damage was limited. The message was not. That night, Paramashiro Island learned a lesson. The Pacific War would repeat again and again. Distance no longer meant safety. The ocean was no longer a shield. It was a path, and the war had just crossed it. The decision to surface so close to the Japanese coast wasn't reckless. It was deliberate and highly controversial. In 1942, American submarines were still figuring out their place in the Pacific War. Their main job was commerce raiding, sink ships, gather intelligence, disappear before the enemy could react. Surfacing within sight of enemy land violated almost every rule meant to keep a submarine alive. But the commander of this boat understood the moment he was in. The early months of the Pacific War had gone badly for the United States. Pearl Harbor was still fresh, and Japanese forces were advancing faster than American commanders could contain them. At that stage, proof mattered almost as much as physical damage, proof that Japan's defensive perimeter could be breached. Paramashiro Island sat squarely on that perimeter. Remote, wind-scoured, and sparsely populated, it marked the northern edge of Japan's sense of security. The Kuril Islands were considered a buffer, not a battlefield. Defenses existed on paper, but constant vigilance did not. The assumption was simple: no enemy would risk coming this far north, this close to home, with no support. That assumption created the opening. The submarine's commander knew that even a short bombardment could force Japan to rethink how it protected its coastline. Guns would be repositioned, patrols expanded, aircraft reassigned. Resources would be pulled away from other fronts where Japan was already under strain. The payoff was strategic, not tactical. Measured in damage alone, the attack achieved little. A handful of buildings were hit. Some infrastructure was damaged. Nothing decisive, but wars aren't judged only by what is destroyed, they're shaped by how the enemy responds. And every response has a cost. The crew knew exactly how exposed they were. They had no armor, no escorts, no air cover. One patrol boat or a single well-placed coastal gun could turn the mission into a disaster. If aircraft appeared, there might be no escape at all. That was why the attack was brief. The gun crew worked with restraint, not bravado. Each round was fired deliberately. There was no lingering, no careful adjustment to perfect the aim, no attempt to confirm results. The goal was simple: strike, then leave. Every shell was a ticking clock. As the last rounds went ashore, lookouts reported movement on land. Lights flickered on. Figures shifted in the darkness. The island was waking up to something it wasn't supposed to experience. That was enough. The order to dive was given. The submarine slipped back beneath the surface as quietly as it had arrived, returning to the one place where it held the advantage. Below the waves, it vanished, leaving only confusion and alarm behind. The attack forced Japanese commanders to face an uncomfortable reality. The war was closer than they wanted to believe. Even the far northern islands were reachable, not by fleets, but by a single submarine willing to break the rules. That realization spread far beyond Paramashiro. It reshaped patrol routes, defense planning, and the psychological map of the conflict. The shells themselves caused little lasting harm. But the idea they carried, that nowhere was truly beyond reach, hit much harder. And once that idea surfaced, it could never be sunk again. On Paramashiro Island, the first reaction was simple disbelief. The explosions had come from the wrong direction. There were no aircraft engines overhead, no warning sirens, no flares drifting down from the sky. For several long moments, no one on shore could make sense of what they were hearing. Then the second shell hit. Only then did reality begin to settle in, uneasily and all at once. Whatever was firing wasn't in the air. It was offshore, close, far too close to fit anyone's idea of how the war was supposed to work. Local military units rushed to respond, but the problem wasn't courage or readiness. It was orientation. Coastal defenses were built to watch for surface ships and incoming aircraft, not a lone submarine quietly surfacing in the dark. Gun crews struggled to find a target. Spotters scanned the water for shapes that melted into the night. Civilians were even slower to understand what was happening. People spilled out of their homes, looking up, expecting bombers. Instead, they saw brief flashes out at sea, unnatural bursts of light that appeared and vanished between the waves. The sound arrived first. The explanation lagged behind. That confusion was exactly what the submarine's commander had anticipated. The attack didn't need to overpower the defenses. It only needed to disrupt certainty. For years, Japan's northern islands had relied on geography as protection. Distance, harsh weather, and isolation were assumed to be defenses in themselves. The shells tore that assumption apart. On shore, reports began moving up the chain of command, but they were fragmented and often contradictory. Some described naval gunfire, others suspected a surface raider. A few even mentioned aircraft, because admitting a submarine had done this felt almost impossible. By the time the picture started to sharpen, the firing had already stopped. Searchlights swept the water too late. Patrol boats were dispatched, but they headed into an ocean with no visible enemy. Aircraft were readied, but there was nothing left to strike. The submarine had slipped back into the Pacific, leaving behind nothing but echoes and unanswered questions. For Japanese commanders, the implications were deeply unsettling. The physical damage was minor. The meaning of the attack was not. If an American submarine could surface here, alone, undetected, and escape without consequence, then the boundaries of vulnerability had just shifted. That realization forced hard questions. How much coastline was just as exposed? How many patrols would be needed to prevent this from happening again? What resources would have to be pulled north, away from active battlefields? These weren't abstract concerns. They demanded immediate decisions, and every decision carried a cost in time, fuel, manpower, and attention. By dawn, Paramashiro Island was on full alert. Defenses were manned. Patrols expanded. Overnight, the island had gone from distant rear area to potential frontline. But the moment itself had already passed. The submarine was gone. The war had brushed the homeland briefly, then slipped away, leaving behind a lingering sense of vulnerability that no amount of fortification could erase overnight. The shells did their real damage not through what they destroyed, but through what they revealed. The Pacific was no longer a moat. It was a road. And for the first time, Japan's northern coast understood that war could arrive quietly, without warning, carried not by fleets or bombers, but by a single vessel surfacing where no one believed it would. The most dangerous part of the mission came after the last shell was fired. As the deck gun was secured, there was no rush. Rushing made noise, and noise near an enemy shoreline could be deadly. Orders were passed calmly. Hatches were sealed. The crew moved with the same measured discipline they would use during a routine dive in open water, because panic, more than enemy fire, could get them killed. The submarine slipped beneath the surface, just as lights began to flicker on along the shore. Below the waves, the boat angled away from land, easing into deeper water where sound behaved differently and pursuit became far less certain. Engine power was reduced. The hull settled into quiet running. Every man aboard listened, not just through instruments, but with instinct sharpened by experience. Above them, the island was fully waking now. Searchlights swept the coastline in wide arcs. Patrol boats pushed out from sheltered inlets, their engines churning water that had been calm only moments earlier. Farther inland, aircrews were scrambling, readying aircraft for searches that had never been routine before that night. But the submarine was already gone. Close to shore, shallow water made sonar unreliable. Sound bounced unpredictably off the seabed and rocky coastline. The submarine took advantage of that confusion, adjusting depth and speed to blur its acoustic trail. With every mile, it moved farther beyond the narrow window in which retaliation was possible. This was where the commander's gamble truly paid off. The timing had been exact. Just after midnight meant fatigue ashore. Darkness delayed identification. And the brief shelling ensured that by the time Japanese defenses understood what had happened, the submarine had already retreated into its element. Below the surface, the silence felt different now. It wasn't the tight, pressing quiet of a chase. It was the fragile stillness that follows a risk you can't undo. Men spoke in whispers. Every unexpected sound, metal settling, water shifting, seemed unnaturally loud. The submarine continued outward into the grey Pacific, careful not to surface again until distance restored safety. The commander knew better than to tempt fate twice in the same place. The mission had done what it needed to do. Pushing further would only erase its success. By dawn, the boat was well clear of the island. The sea returned to its familiar rhythm. No propellers followed. No sonar pings intruded. The ocean once again became a shield. Only then did the crew allow themselves to fully grasp what they had done. They hadn't sunk ships. They hadn't fought a fleet. They had fired a handful of shells and changed the psychological shape of the war. Tactically, the mission was modest. Strategically, it was provocative. And on a human level, it was unforgettable. The submarine had surfaced where no one expected it, spoken briefly in gunfire, and vanished again, leaving behind a coastline that would never feel entirely removed from the war. The Pacific closed behind the boat, but the message carried ashore would keep moving long after the wake disappeared. The shells stopped falling, but their effects kept spreading. Within hours, reports from Paramashiro Island reached higher levels of command. The confusion had been stripped away, the details condensed into something far more troubling. The summary was brief: short naval bombardment, unidentified submarine, limited damage, but the implication was clear. An American submarine had surfaced and fired on Japanese territory at will. That single fact forced a reassessment far beyond the Kuril Islands. Until then, Japanese defensive planning relied on distance. The home islands were shielded by geography, harsh weather, and the belief that any serious attack would arrive openly, carried by fleets or aircraft. Submarines were seen as a danger to shipping, not to the land itself. That belief no longer held. Naval planners were now faced with an uncomfortable truth. Submarines could bypass traditional warning systems entirely. They needed no airspace, no formations, no buildup that intelligence could spot in advance. A single boat, operating alone, could appear wherever the coastline was vulnerable. The response was quiet but decisive. Patrol schedules were revised. Coastal watch stations were reinforced. Small vessels were pulled from other assignments to maintain a constant presence near exposed stretches of shore. Aircraft once tasked with distant patrols were reassigned to watch waters closer to home. None of this made headlines, but all of it consumed resources. Fuel, crews, maintenance time, attention. Every destroyer guarding a northern island was one less available elsewhere. Every aircraft shifted to coastal patrol was one less supporting operations farther south. The shells hadn't crippled factories or ports, but they had forced a redistribution of effort. That was the real cost. Japanese command didn't panic, it adapted. But adaptation under pressure always carried trade-offs, and in 1942, Japan had very little room for them. For the American submarine force, this was exactly the result they were looking for. The mission proved that submarines weren't just tools of attrition, they were weapons of reach. With the right timing, they could turn any stretch of coastline into a front line, even if only for a few minutes. Aboard the submarine, the crew felt none of this directly. Their world was still sea and sky as the patrol continued. But the commander understood that the value of what they'd done would never show up in photographs or damage reports. It would show up in the enemy's thinking. From that night on, Japanese planners had to ask a new question every time they studied a map. Could a submarine reach here? There was no reassuring answer. The war hadn't simply moved closer to home. It had proven it could arrive without warning, speak briefly, and disappear, leaving behind a defensive problem with no simple solution. The coastline remained. The towns still stood. But the belief that distance alone could keep them safe was gone. And once that belief was broken, no amount of patrols could fully restore it. Once the tension faded, the patrol slipped back into its familiar rhythm. Inside the submarine, there was no celebration, no speeches, no sense that anything historic had just taken place. The crew returned to the routines that defined life underwater: maintenance checks, navigation updates, long watches broken only by meals and sleep. That return to normal felt almost unreal. Only days earlier, the boat had surfaced off an enemy coastline and fired on Japanese territory. Now it was once again a shadow beneath the Pacific, moving through empty water as if nothing unusual had happened at all. That contrast was typical of submarine warfare. Extraordinary moments were followed almost immediately by monotony. Risk gave way to routine so fast it barely had time to sink in. Each man processed the experience in his own way, usually in silence. Some replayed the brief flashes of gunfire in their minds. Others focused intently on mechanical tasks, grounding themselves in procedure. The commander reviewed the attack without emotion. The shelling had been short, accuracy was acceptable, no return fire, the escape had gone smoothly. From an operational standpoint, the mission had unfolded exactly as planned. And yet, something about it felt unfinished. There was no clear confirmation of what had been hit beyond the initial flashes, no direct sense of the reaction ashore. Submarines rarely saw the full effects of their actions, but this time that distance felt sharper. The attack had been about impact, not destruction, and impact was harder to measure from beneath the surface. Still, the commander knew that silence didn't mean insignificance. War didn't always shift in obvious ways. Sometimes it moved quietly through altered patrol routes, delayed operations, and decisions made far from the point of contact. The submarine would never witness those changes firsthand, but it would feel them later in subtle ways as enemy movements grew more cautious or less concentrated elsewhere. For the crew, the most immediate effect was psychological. They had proven something to themselves. Submarines weren't confined to hunting ships at sea. They could decide where the war appeared. They could disrupt expectations. They could force the enemy to adjust. That understanding stayed with them. As the patrol continued, the ocean remained empty. No targets emerged. No alarms sounded. The boat pressed on, conserving fuel, conserving energy, conserving risk. Above, clouds drifted endlessly across the Pacific sky. Below, the crew lived inside steel and routine, carrying the quiet awareness that they had brushed against history and then slipped back into anonymity. The war went on, but it now carried one more uncertainty within it. In Japan, the response unfolded over weeks, not hours. The initial confusion slowly gave way to analysis. The attack was no longer treated as a one-off incident, but as a signal. Naval intelligence began charting likely submarine approach routes. Coastal commanders were told to rethink their assumptions about where the threat might come from. The most uncomfortable conclusion was also the simplest. There was no sure way to stop a determined submarine from reaching the coast. The sea was too wide, the shoreline too long. There simply weren't enough resources to watch every mile all the time. Defensive planning shifted away from total prevention and toward mitigation, earlier warnings, faster reactions, and a readiness for surprise. It was a subtle change, but an important one. Instead of assuming safety, commanders now planned around vulnerability. That shift reshaped patrol patterns. It altered how ships, aircraft, and crews were assigned. Northern islands that had once been treated as peripheral suddenly became potential contact zones rather than quiet rear areas. And all of it traced back to a handful of shells fired in the dark. The attack hadn't weakened Japan's ability to fight. It had weakened its confidence in distance. From a strategic standpoint, the bombardment of Paramashiro Island didn't change the outcome of any campaign or battle on its own. Its significance lay somewhere else. It showed that modern war didn't respect boundaries as cleanly as planners liked to believe. A single platform, operating on its own, could project force into areas once thought protected by distance and geography. In that sense, it was a preview. Later in the war, Japan would endure far more destructive attacks on its home islands, mostly from the air and in overwhelming numbers. But those strikes came after long build-ups and clear warning signs. This one didn't. It arrived quietly. It departed without a fight. And in that brief window, it revealed that the line between the front and the homeland was already beginning to blur, even as early as 1942. For the U.S. Navy, the lesson mattered just as much. Submarines weren't only tools for hunting ships. They were instruments of presence. They could shape how the enemy thought, pull resources out of position, and stretch defenses thin. That realization would go on to influence how submarines were used for the rest of the war. For the people living on Paramashiro Island, the memory settled indifferently. The damage was repaired, daily life resumed, the war carried on somewhere else, and yet something essential had changed. The belief that the conflict was distant, that it stayed beyond the horizon, was gone. The ocean, once seen as a boundary, had revealed itself as a route. That realization lingered in quiet moments, returning whenever the sea lay calm or the night grew unusually still. The flashes offshore and the explosions inland couldn't be erased from memory. The war had touched home, if only briefly. And that was enough. When a US submarine shelled a Japanese town in 1942, it didn't shift the balance of power overnight. What it changed was perception. The attack showed that distance was no longer a shield, that the sea could deliver war just as easily as it once kept it at bay, that even a single vessel, operating alone, could collapse the space between the battlefield and home. The submarine fired its shells and disappeared. But the idea it carried stayed behind. In the Pacific War, the moment the conflict reached home wasn't marked by invasion or occupation. It arrived quietly, just after midnight, carried by a deck gun and a crew willing to surface where no one expected them. That was enough to redraw the mental map of the war. And once that map was changed, it could never go back to what it had been before.